Nobody really tells you what this particular stage of life feels like from the inside, not honestly anyway. You get the greeting card version, the version where everyone assures you it's supposed to feel peaceful, well-earned, a long-deserved reward after decades of work. And for some people, I'm sure that's exactly true. But for a lot of us, it doesn't feel like that at all, at least not right away, and nobody prepares you for the gap between what you're supposed to feel and what you're actually feeling. I want to pause here for just a second because I know some of what I've just described might be landing close to home for some of you, and I don't want to rush past it. If any part of this is resonating, take a moment, sit with it. There's no need to have an answer right now. But if you're the kind of person who finds these stories useful, who likes hearing how other people actually got through the parts of life that don't come with instructions, I'd really appreciate it if you hit subscribe before we go any further, because there's a lot more of this story left, and honestly, a lot more stories like it waiting after this one. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, not in some abstract algorithm sense, though sure, there's that too, but in a more direct way. It tells me these stories are actually reaching people, actually landing somewhere, and that keeps me motivated to keep telling them honestly instead of dressing them up. I'll be honest, when I first started sharing pieces of my own life like this, I wasn't sure anyone would care, wasn't sure a story about an ordinary person going through an ordinary hard stretch of life would be worth anyone's time when there's no shortage of louder, flashier things competing for attention out there. But it turns out a lot of people are quietly hungry for exactly this, not spectacle, just honesty, just someone willing to say the true, unglamorous parts of a hard chapter out loud instead of skipping straight to the tidy resolution. So, if that's what's kept you listening this far, subscribing is a small thing that means a lot, and it makes sure you don't miss where this story goes, or the ones that come after it. Alright, back to it, because there's a fair bit more to tell, and I don't want to leave you hanging on the part that comes next, which, honestly, is where things really started to shift. A gap that can be quietly disorienting precisely because you don't have the vocabulary for it yet, and everyone around you seems to assume you're fine. I spent a long stretch of time inside that gap without really naming it, telling myself I should feel grateful, telling myself plenty of people would trade places with me in a heartbeat, and using that comparison to talk myself out of admitting that something still felt hollow underneath all the things I supposedly had going for me. I think a lot of people do this. We measure our situation against some imagined worse version of it, and use the comparison as a reason not to take our own discomfort seriously, as though only the most extreme version of a problem deserves to be acknowledged. I don't think that's true, and it took me a long time and a fair amount of quiet suffering to unlearn it. What I want to tell you today is what actually happened once I stopped comparing my life to some hypothetical worse one and started being honest about what mine actually felt like from the inside. It wasn't a comfortable process. Honesty about your own life rarely is, at least not at first, but it was the only thing that actually led anywhere, and I think that's worth saying plainly to anyone out there quietly telling themselves they don't have the right to want more than what they've already got. You do have that right. Wanting more isn't ingratitude, it's just being honest about being alive, and it's usually the very first step toward anything actually changing. Stick with me and I'll walk you through what came next, the doubts and all, because I think the doubts are exactly the part that will feel most familiar if you're standing somewhere close to where I was standing back then. I want you to picture something for me. 3 of your adult children fly 8,000 miles, specifically to convince you to come home, and by the end of the week, 2 of them are asking whether you think there's a spare unit in your building. That's not how the trip was supposed to go. I'm Carol. I'm 72 years old, and about 10 months ago, my 3 kids flew to the Philippines to bring their mother home, and they left, every single one of them, quietly wondering if they'd been the ones who had it backwards this whole time. Before I tell you how that week actually unfolded, if stories like this speak to you, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because there's plenty more coming, and I think you'll want to be around for it. Let me back up first, because none of this makes sense without knowing how I ended up on the other side of the world in the first place. My husband Frank and I were married 44 years. We raised 3 kids in a suburb outside Denver, Colorado. in a house we bought the year our oldest was born, and never left, not once, not even when the kids kept telling us we were rattling around in too much house for two people. Frank worked as a civil engineer for the city for most of his career, the kind of job that had him out inspecting bridges and drainage systems in every kind of Colorado weather imaginable. And I taught high school English for 29 years. The kind of job where you spend 3 decades convincing teenagers that Hemingway is worth their attention, and mostly, I think, succeeding maybe a third of the time, which felt like a win most years. We weren't a flashy couple. We never took the big European vacations some of our friends took, never remodeled the kitchen the way half the neighborhood eventually did. We just built something steady, year after year, the kind of marriage that doesn't make for a dramatic story until suddenly, with a diagnosis, it does. Frank died 2 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in March, gone by October, 7 months, that felt both impossibly long and impossibly short, depending on which hour of which day you asked me. There's a particular cruelty to pancreatic cancer that I don't think people fully understand until they've lived inside it. The way it takes so long to diagnose and then moves so fast once it's found, so that you barely have time to reorganize your entire understanding of the future before the future itself has already changed shape again. Frank spent his last few months determined to keep things as normal as possible, insisting we still watch our shows in the evening, still take our short walks around the block, even once they'd shrunk down to barely a quarter of what they used to be. And I think that determination of his, that refusal to let the illness fully rewrite every single hour of what remained, is probably the single thing I carried with me most directly into what I eventually decided to do. We'd been married 44 years, and I want to be honest that the loneliness after he died wasn't dramatic. It was just constant, a low hum underneath everything. Present the moment I woke up, and still there when I finally managed to fall asleep. It wasn't the kind of grief you can point to and say, "There, that's the hard part, get through that and it eases." It was more like the entire architecture of my days had quietly collapsed, because so much of what filled them, meals planned around what he could still manage to eat, medication schedules, the particular rhythm of caring for someone, had simply vanished the moment he was gone, leaving behind hours that used to be full and were now just empty in a way I didn't know how to fill. My kids, Rebecca, Thomas, and Jennifer, were wonderful in the immediate aftermath, the way I imagine most kids are wonderful in the immediate aftermath, showing up with casseroles and taking turns staying over so I wasn't alone those first few weeks. Rebecca lives in Denver herself, only 20 minutes from the house, and she became something close to my daily check-in, stopping by most evenings on her way home from work, sometimes just to sit with me for 20 minutes while I pretended to watch whatever she'd put on television. Thomas is in Seattle, and Jennifer's in Austin, both of them far enough that visits were more occasional, holidays mostly, but the phone calls from both of them picked up considerably once Frank was gone, weekly at minimum, sometimes more. I want to say clearly that none of my children ever treated me the way some families apparently treat a newly widowed parent. No brochures showed up on my kitchen table. Nobody suggested I couldn't manage my own affairs. If anything, my situation was almost the opposite problem. I was managed with such gentle, constant care that I started to feel less like a woman grieving her husband and more like a fragile object everyone had quietly agreed needed monitoring, which is a strange, uncomfortable thing to notice about people who love you and mean nothing but good by it. Rebecca would call twice some days just to make sure I'd eaten something. Thomas started sending articles about grief support groups, always with a gentle, no pressure, just thought this looked interesting attached, the kind of framing that somehow makes the pressure feel heavier rather than lighter. Jennifer would ask, almost every call, whether I'd thought about getting a dog for company, a suggestion she repeated often enough that I eventually understood it wasn't really about the dog at all. It was about her own anxiety over an empty house needing something, anything, to fill it. About a year after Frank passed, I started feeling something I couldn't quite name, a kind of restlessness underneath the grief that didn't feel like grief exactly, more like a slow, dawning sense that the life I was still technically living, the house, the routines, the same grocery store, the same 3 restaurants Frank and I used to rotate through, wasn't actually mine anymore, in any meaningful sense. It had been ours, and now that he was gone, I was just going through motions built for 2 people, alone, in a house that had never once, in 39 years, felt this large. I'd stand in the kitchen some evenings and realize I'd been staring into the refrigerator for several minutes without actually registering anything inside it. Just standing there, because standing somewhere felt marginally better than sitting in the living room where his chair still sat exactly where it always had, angled just slightly toward the television the way he liked it. The idea of the Philippines came, oddly enough, from one of my former students. I'd run into her at a grocery store of all places, a woman named Diane who'd been in my junior year English class decades earlier and had since become, among other things, a retired travel journalist who'd spent years covering Southeast Asia. We got to talking in the produce aisle, of all the unglamorous places for a life-altering conversation to start, comparing notes on cantaloupes of all things, and she mentioned, almost in passing, that she and her husband spent every winter now in a small city called Dumaguete, on the island of Negros, and that it had become, in her words, the best-kept secret for anyone tired of being cold and tired of being invisible. I laughed it off at the time, made some joke about how at 71 I'd rather stay invisible in a warm climate than freeze somewhere visible. But something about that phrase, tired of being invisible, followed me home from the grocery store and stayed with me for weeks afterward, resurfacing at odd moments, while I was folding laundry, while I was sitting through another well-meaning but slightly hollow dinner with a neighbor who clearly felt obligated to keep inviting the recently widowed woman next door. I started researching, quietly, the way I imagine a lot of people research the thing they're not ready to admit they're actually considering. I read about the Special Resident Retirees Visa. I joined a couple of online groups for expat retirees in the Philippines, mostly just reading at first, absorbing other people's stories, other widows and widowers who'd made some version of the same leap I was starting to imagine, comparing notes on cost of living, on healthcare, on the specific, practical fear of what happens if something goes wrong, far from your own children. I decided eventually to take a trip, just a trip, 3 weeks, to see it for myself before I let myself think any further about what it might mean. I told Rebecca I was going on a vacation with a former colleague, which was sort of true, since Diane agreed to meet me out there for the first week and show me around before flying home to her own routine. Rebecca was surprised but supportive, said it sounded like exactly the kind of thing I needed. Some time away, some sunshine, and I remember feeling a small pang of guilt even then, letting her believe this was simply a vacation when some part of me already suspected it was closer to an audition. I flew into Manila and then down to Dumaguete, and Diane met me at the small airport there with a hug and an immediate, "Well, what do you think so far?" I hadn't even left the terminal yet, but something about the air, warm and thick, and completely unlike the dry Colorado cold I'd left behind, already felt like a small permission slip I hadn't known I was waiting for. Dumaguete turned out to be exactly what Diane had described. Walkable, manageable, small enough to feel knowable within a couple of weeks, but genuinely full. A university town with a long boulevard running along the waterfront where people gathered every single evening. Families, students, old men playing checkers at little tables, vendors selling grilled corn and fruit shakes out of carts that lit up as the sun went down. I spent that first week mostly just walking, sitting on benches along that boulevard, watching the way an entire town seemed to spill outside after dinner, instead of retreating indoors, the way most of Denver did the moment the sun set. I met people almost immediately, which surprised me more than it probably should have. A woman running a small cafe near my guest house, Marilou, started remembering my order by my third visit and would ask, genuinely, how my day had gone, actually waiting for the answer rather than treating it as a pleasantry. An older gentleman named Ernesto, a retired professor from the local university, struck up a conversation with me on a bench one evening simply because I was reading a book he recognized, and we ended up talking for almost 2 hours about literature, about Hemingway, about whether teenagers anywhere in the world actually appreciate him at 17 or only come to it later. A conversation that reminded me, sharply and pleasantly, of exactly the kind of discussion I used to have in my own classroom decades earlier. Except now, I was having it as an equal, rather than as the person tasked with dragging reluctant teenagers toward appreciation. By the end of that first week, Diane had to fly home, and I had 2 more weeks entirely on my own, which I'd been slightly dreading, and which turned out to be the most important part of the whole trip. Alone, I had to actually navigate things myself, figure out the local jeepneys, negotiate at the market, find my own rhythm rather than following Diane's established one. I remember the first time I successfully talked a tricycle driver down to a fair price entirely on my own, without Diane there to translate or negotiate on my behalf, and how absurdly proud of myself I felt over something so small, a feeling I hadn't had in longer than I wanted to admit. And somewhere in that process of fumbling through on my own, I noticed something had shifted. I wasn't managing loneliness anymore. I was just living, clumsily, in a new place, the way anyone lives clumsily in a new place, and it felt entirely different from the particular flavor of loneliness I'd been carrying around Denver for over a year. I flew home with a decision more or less made, though I sat with it quietly for another 4 months before I told anyone. I did the practical work first, consulted an attorney, looked into the visa requirements thoroughly, set up international health insurance, priced out what selling the house might actually net me against what a comparable life in Dumaguete would cost. I spent evenings at the kitchen table with a legal pad, the same kind of methodical planning I used to bring to lesson plans decades earlier, working through every objection I imagined my kids would raise before they ever had the chance to raise it themselves. And once I had real answers rather than just a feeling, I called a family meeting, the 3 of them on a video call together, the way we occasionally did for anything that concerned all of us. I told them I was planning to move to the Philippines, permanently, and that I'd already done the research and had answers ready for whatever questions they had. There was a long silence on that call, the kind where you can practically hear 3 adult children exchanging glances through a screen that only shows one face at a time. Rebecca spoke first, careful, gentle, asking whether this was really about the Philippines or about missing Dad, whether I'd talked to anyone, a counselor, about what I was going through. Thomas was more direct, asked how I could possibly manage healthcare that far away at 71 years old, alone, with no family nearby. Jennifer mostly just asked, quietly, whether I was sure, in a tone that wasn't accusatory so much as genuinely worried. I answered every question as calmly and as thoroughly as I could. I told them about the insurance, about the visa, about the attorney, about the specific city, and why I'd chosen it. I told them, honestly, that I understood their worry completely, that I'd have worried too in their position, but that I'd spent 3 weeks there feeling more like myself than I had in the entire year since their father died, and that I needed them to trust that I still knew my own mind well enough to make a decision this significant. They didn't fully come around on that call, not that I expected them to, but over the following months, as I sold the house and finalized the details, their tone shifted gradually, from resistance to a kind of resigned, still worried support, the kind where you can tell your family loves you enough to let you do something they don't fully understand yet. Rebecca, in particular, struggled with the house itself, came over one weekend to help me sort through decades of belongings, and ended up sitting on the floor of what used to be her childhood bedroom holding an old yearbook, crying in a way that had less to do with the yearbook itself, and more, I think, to do with the finality of watching her mother close one chapter so definitively while she was still working through her own grief over her father. I flew out permanently about 6 months after that first trip, one-way ticket, considerably lighter luggage than I imagine most people bring when uprooting an entire life, since I'd sold or given away nearly everything beyond what mattered most: photographs, a few pieces of francs, some books I couldn't part with, including, somewhat sentimentally, the same battered copy of A Farewell to Arms I'd used to teach from for 2 decades. Ernesto, the retired professor from that bench conversation, had actually helped me find a small rental online before I even landed, a modest 2-bedroom place, a short walk from that same waterfront boulevard, renting for around 15,000 pesos a month, something close to $270, an amount that made me sit down heavily the first time I calculated it against what I'd been paying just to heat that big, empty house in Denver. The first months of actually living there, rather than just visiting, were harder than that initial trip had prepared me for, the way I think anyone who's made a similar move eventually admits. I didn't know the town the way a resident knows it yet. I got overcharged at the market more than once until the vendors got to know my face. I had days of real loneliness, days I called Rebecca and cried on the phone, not because I regretted the decision exactly, but because grief doesn't actually leave just because the scenery changes. It just finds new rooms to sit in, and some evenings that first apartment, unfamiliar and still half unpacked, felt every bit as empty as the house I'd left behind, just with better weather outside the window. But slowly, the same way it had started during that first trip, a life began forming around me. Marilu at the cafe became a genuine friend rather than just a familiar face, and she started including me, unprompted, in things: a birthday celebration for her daughter, a small gathering at her sister's house, treating me like an honorary member of her family within a matter of months. She has a way of simply assuming your presence at things rather than formally inviting you, which I've come to understand is less an oversight and more a genuine sign of how thoroughly she'd absorbed me into her circle, the same way Nita and Feli and half a dozen other women across these stories seem to operate, treating hospitality less as an event and more as an ongoing, unspoken policy. Ernesto and I fell into a rhythm of meeting most Thursday evenings on that same bench, talking about whatever book either of us happened to be reading, a friendship that had nothing romantic about it and everything to do with 2 former teachers who'd both spent decades explaining the same handful of great books to reluctant students, and finally had someone who understood exactly what that particular kind of exhaustion and joy felt like. He introduced me, eventually, to a small informal book club that met monthly at a bookstore cafe downtown, mostly retired academics and a handful of younger writers, and I found myself, for the first time in longer than I could easily remember, genuinely excited before a social gathering, rather than simply enduring one out of obligation. I found my way into volunteering with a local literacy program aimed at adult learners, people who'd left school young for various reasons and were coming back, often in their 30s and 40s, to finally finish their education. 29 years of teaching high schoolers turned out to translate remarkably well to a room full of adults who actually wanted to be there, who asked questions out of genuine hunger rather than obligation, and within a few months, I was going 3 mornings a week, looking forward to it in a way I hadn't looked forward to much of anything in the 1.5 years since Frank died. There was a woman in that program, Corazon, maybe 35, who'd left school after 8th grade to help support her family and had spent nearly 2 decades believing she simply wasn't capable of the kind of writing the rest of us take for granted. Watching her write her first genuinely confident paragraph, watching her read it aloud to the small group with her hands actually steady for once, was, without exaggeration, one of the more purely joyful moments I'd had in years, the kind of thing that used to happen occasionally in my Denver classroom, and that I hadn't realized, until it happened again here, how much I'd been missing. About 8 months after I'd moved, I had a health scare, a fall on a wet tile floor that left me with a badly bruised hip and enough of a scare that Ernesto, who happened to be with me at the time, insisted on taking me straight to Silliman University Medical Center, one of the main hospitals in Dumaguete. Nothing was broken, thankfully, just a deep bruise and a thorough scare. But the visit, X-rays included, cost a little over 3,000 pesos, something close to $55, and the whole experience, prompt, professional, kind, did more to settle my own private worries about aging alone in a foreign country than any amount of research beforehand ever could have. A young doctor there, Dr. Panganiban, spent a full 20 minutes going over my history in detail, unhurried, thorough, the kind of appointment I'd nearly forgotten was possible after years of increasingly rushed 15-minute slots back in the States. I called Rebecca afterward, mostly so she wouldn't hear about it secondhand and immediately assume the worst, and I told her the whole story honestly, including how quickly Ernesto had gotten me there and how thorough the care had been. She was quiet for a moment and then said something that stuck with me, that it sounded almost easier to get seen quickly there than it would have been back home, waiting in some Denver urgent care on a Tuesday afternoon. It was around the 10-month mark that the three of them decided, together, to fly out. Not casually, not as a vacation. They told me directly on the call that they wanted to come see the situation for themselves, that they'd talked among themselves and agreed it was time to actually assess whether this was sustainable long-term, whether their 72-year-old mother, living alone on the other side of the world, was something they should be more actively pushing back against. I understood the impulse completely, even as I felt a familiar flicker of the same managed feeling I'd noticed back in Denver. 3 adult children coordinating an intervention dressed up as a visit. They arrived together, all 3 of them, landing within a few hours of each other so they could travel down to Dumaguete as a group. I met them at the small airport, and I could see it on their faces immediately, a kind of braced, careful concern, the look of people who'd mentally prepared themselves for finding their mother diminished, isolated, perhaps not managing as well as her phone calls had suggested. What they found instead started shifting things almost immediately. I took them straight to Marilou's cafe that first evening, and Marilou, without any prompting from me, greeted all 3 of them like she'd known them for years, insisted on feeding them far more than they could reasonably eat, and spent a good 20 minutes telling Rebecca specifically about the small kindnesses I'd apparently done for her family over the past several months, that I hadn't even thought to mention myself, helping her daughter with English homework, sitting with her sister during a difficult month after a divorce. Rebecca looked at me across that table with an expression I hadn't seen from her in a long time, something between surprise and a kind of relief she probably hadn't expected to feel. Thomas, who I think had privately braced himself the hardest for finding me isolated, came with me to my Thursday evening on the bench with Ernesto, and the 2 of them ended up in an animated conversation about local politics that ran well past the hour I'd normally spend there. Thomas clearly startled by how quickly a genuine friendship had apparently formed, and how substantive it actually was. He told me later that night, back at the small guest house I'd booked for them, that he'd expected to find me lonely, and instead found me with what looked like a richer social calendar than he currently had himself back in Seattle. He even, a little sheepishly, asked Ernesto for a couple of book recommendations before we left the bench that night, which felt like its own small, unspoken sign of approval. Jennifer came with me to the literacy program on their second morning, and I watched her sit quietly in the back of the room as I worked with Corazon on a piece of writing about her own daughter's first day of school. Watched Jennifer's face as Corazon, near the end of the session, thanked me with real emotion for finally helping something click that had confused her for years. Afterward, walking back along the boulevard, Jennifer was quiet for a while before she said, "Mom, I don't think I've ever actually seen you teach before. Not really, not like that. It struck me, hearing her say it, that she was right, that in 30-some years of being her mother, she'd genuinely never watched me do the thing I'd spent nearly 3 decades doing professionally, and something about finally seeing it seemed to land on her harder than any explanation over the phone ever could have. We spent the rest of that week together doing what I'd now consider ordinary life. The market, the boulevard in the evenings, a day trip to a nearby waterfall that all 3 of them insisted on despite my gentle suggestion that 72-year-old knees might prefer a shorter hike, a hike that ended with all 4 of us soaked from an unplanned swim beneath the falls, and laughing harder together than we had in the 2 years since Frank's funeral. Somewhere around the 4th day, I noticed the tenor of their questions had shifted entirely. No longer, "How are you managing?" but instead, "How much does a place like this actually cost?" And "What's the visa situation for someone who wanted to spend part of the year here?" And, from Rebecca specifically, on our last evening together, sitting on the small balcony of my rental, with the sound of the boulevard drifting up from below, "Is there any chance there's another unit free in this building, or nearby?" I keep thinking about how much Dad would have loved this. I want to be honest that I hadn't expected that question. Not from any of them, not that week. I'd braced myself, the same way they'd apparently braced themselves, for a week of gentle pressure, careful arguments about safety and distance and whether this was really sustainable for a woman my age. Instead, by the end of it, Thomas was seriously researching remote work visas, having realized his software consulting job could theoretically be done from more or less anywhere with decent internet. Jennifer talked, more tentatively but genuinely, about whether her husband might consider a sabbatical year somewhere like this, while their kids were still young enough that international school wouldn't be too disruptive. And Rebecca, who lived the closest to me back in Denver, and had, I think, felt the most guilt about my being so far away, spent the last 2 days of that trip talking with real seriousness about whether she could realistically split her year between Denver and Dumaguete, once her own kids were a little further along in school. On their last night, the 4 of us sat together on that same balcony, and Rebecca said something I've thought about often since. She said, "We came here to convince you to come home. I think what actually happened is you showed us what home could look like instead." I didn't have much of a response to that beyond simply crying a little, which none of us seemed to mind. They flew home the following morning, and the calls since then have carried a completely different texture than they did in that first year after Frank died. Less checking in out of worry, more genuine curiosity, questions about Marilou's family, about how Ernesto's latest reading project was going, about the literacy program, and which student had made the most progress that week. Thomas has since had 2 actual conversations with his employer about a trial period working remotely from here for a few months next year. Jennifer's husband, apparently, has started quietly looking into international school options in Dumaguete, more out of curiosity than commitment, but curiosity is further than any of them had gotten before that trip. Rebecca has already booked a 2-week visit for the coming spring, this time explicitly billed, to everyone's amusement, as scouting rather than any kind of intervention. It's been 10 months now since that visit, almost a year and a half total, since I first landed here, uncertain of anything beyond a vague restlessness I couldn't quite name. I still think of Frank every single day, still catch myself wanting to tell him something funny that happened at the market, still feel that particular ache of a 44-year marriage that doesn't simply end just because the person is gone. But I've stopped feeling invisible, the way Diane put it that day in the grocery store produce aisle, a phrase that turned out to be more prophetic than either of us realized at the time. I have Marilou's family treating me like their own. I have Ernesto's Thursday evenings, and the argument we're currently having about whether Hemingway is overrated, an argument I suspect will run for years without either of us budging an inch. I have a room full of adult learners 3 mornings a week who remind me, constantly, why I loved teaching in the first place, before the particular exhaustion of 30 years in one building had worn some of that love thin. I'm 72 years old, and my children flew 8,000 miles, fully intending to bring me home. And instead, every single one of them left wondering whether they'd had the whole idea of home slightly backwards. I don't know exactly what happens next, whether any of them actually follow through on the things they talked about on that balcony, whether Thomas gets his remote work trial, or Jennifer's family ever actually makes the leap. But I know that for 1 week, my kids came looking for a mother they were worried had lost her way, and instead found her exactly where she was supposed to be. And I think, more than almost anything else since Frank died, that's the thing that's actually let me finally exhale. If any part of this sounds like your own family, worried about a parent doing something unexpected, or a parent wondering whether it's too late to go find something unexpected for yourself, I hope this gave you something to hold on to. And if you'd like more stories like this one, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because there's plenty more coming, and I think you'll want to be around for them. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next one.